Hiya! Welcome to Sniper's Rest. Sniper's Rest is the last best rest stop in the here and there, the place between where you're coming from and where you're going. I am Sniper Shadow, and I reside here in Sniper's Rest as a guide and a custodian to those who pass through here. I visit the worlds within the multiverse often, but I am always here to guide and care for travelers such as yourself that pass through the here and there. Welcome, my friend. How are you today? We have been very busy this week. So many folks stopping by, there must be many new multiverses appearing. It happens around this time of year. Come in out of the cold, and as always, please take a rest here before continuing your journey. Today, we continue reading the series of short stories by H.P. Lovecraft. The Dreams in the Witch House was written in January of 1932 and first published in the July 1933 issue of Weird Tales. It is said to be part of the Cthulhu mythos, so let's dive in. Whether the dreams brought on the fever or the fever brought on the dreams, Walter Gilman did not know. Behind everything crouched the brooding, festering horror of the ancient town and of the mouldy, unhallowed garret gable where he wrote and studied and wrestled with his figures and formulae. And he was not tossing on the meagre iron bed. His ears were growing sensitive to prenaturnal and intolerable degree, and he had long ago stopped the cheap mantel clock whose ticking come to seem like a thunder of artillery. At night, the subtle stirring of the black city outside and the sinister scurrying of rats in wormy petitions and the creaking of hidden timbers in the centuried house where to give him sense of strident pandemonium. The darkness always teemed with unexplained sounds, and yet sometimes he shook with fear lest the noises he heard should subside, and allowed him to hear certain other fainter noises which he suspected were lurking behind them. He was in the changeless, legend-haunted city of Arkham, with its clustering bramble roofs that sway and sag over attics where witches hid from king's men in the dark, olden days of the province. Nor was any spot in the city more steeped in macabre memory than the gable room which harboured him, for it was this house and this room which had likewise harboured old Keziah Mason, whose flight from Salem jail at the last no one was ever able to explain. That was in 1692. The jailer had gone mad and babbled of a small white-fanged furry thing which scuttled out of Keziah's cell, and not even Cotton Mather could explain the curves and angles smeared on the grey stone wall in some red, sticky fluid. Possibly Gilman ought not to have studied so hard. Non-Euclidean calculus and quantum physics are enough to stretch any brain, and when one mixes them with folklore and tries to trace a strange background of multi-dimensional reality behind the ghoulish hints of the Gothic tales and the wild whispers of the chimney corner, one can hardly expect to be wholly free from mental tension. Gilman came for Haverhill, but it was only after he had entered the college in Arkham that he began to connect his mathematics with the fantastic legends of elder magic. Something in the air of the hoary town worked obscurely on his imagination. The professors at Miskatonic had urged him to slacken up, and had voluntarily cut down his course at several points. Moreover, they had stopped him from consulting the dubious old books on forbidden secrets that were kept under lock and key in a vault at the university library. But all these precautions came late in the day, so that Gilman had some terrible hints from the dreaded Necronomicon of Abdul Arazad, the fragmentary Book of Ibion, and the suppressed Unsprachen Kulten of von Zutz, to correlate with his abstract formulae on the properties of space and the linkage of dimensions known and unknown. He knew his room was in the old witch house. That indeed was why he had taken it. There was much in the Essex country records about Keziah Mason's trial, and what she had admitted under pressure of the court of Oyer and Termina had fascinated Gilman beyond all reason. She had told Judge Hawthorne of lines and curves that could be made to point out directions leading through the walls of space to other spaces beyond, and had implied that such lines and curves were frequently used at a certain midnight meeting in the dark valleys of the white stone beyond the meadow hill and the unpeopled island in the river. She had spoken of a man, of her oath, and of the new secret name of Nahab. Then she had drawn those devices on the walls of her cell and vanished. Gilman believed strange things about Keziah, and had felt a queer thrill on learning that her dwelling was still standing after more than 235 years. When he heard the hushed Arkham whispers about Keziah's persistent presence in the old house and in the narrow streets, about the irregular human tooth marks left on certain sleepers that in other houses, about the childish cries heard near May Eve and Hallow Mass, about the stench often noted in the old house's attic after those dreaded seasons, and about the small, furry, sharp-toothed thing which haunted the mouldering structure and the town and nuzzled people's curiosity in the black hours before dawn. Resolved to live in this place at any cost. The room was easy to secure, for the house was unpopular, hard to rent, and long given over to cheap lodgings. Gilman could not have told what he expected to find there, but he knew he wanted to be in the building where some circumstances had more or less suddenly given a mediocre old woman of the 17th century an insight into mathematical depths perhaps beyond the utmost modern delvings of Planck, Heisenberg, Einstein, and de Sitter. He studied the timber and the plaster walls for traces of cryptic designs at every accessible spot where the paper had peeled, and within a week had managed to get the eastern attic room where Keziah was held to have practice her spells. It had been vacant from the first, for no one had ever been willing to stay there long, but the Polish landlord had grown wary about renting it. Yet, whatever happened to Gilman till about the time of the fever, no ghostly Keziah filtered through the sombre halls and chambers, no small furry thing crept into his dismal eyrie to nuzzle him. No record of the witch's incantations awarded his constant search. Sometimes he would take walks through the shadowy tangles of unpaved, musty-smelling lanes where eldritch brown houses of unknown age leaned and tottered and leered mockingly through narrow paned windows. He knew strange things had happened once, and there was a faint suggestion behind the surface that everything of that monstrous past might not, at least in the darkest, narrowest, and most intricately crooked alleyways, have utterly perished. He rowed out twice to the ill-regarded island on the river, and made a sketch of singular angles described by the moss-grown rows of grey-standing stones whose origins were so obscure and immemorial. Gilman's room was of good size, but queerly irregular shape, the north wall slanting perceptibly inwards from an outer to an inner end, while the low ceiling slanted gently downwards at the same direction. Aside from an obvious rat hole, the signs of other stopped-up ones, there was no access nor any appearance of a former avenue of access to the space which must have existed between the slanting wall and the straight outer wall of the house's northern side. Through a view from the exterior shewed where a window had been boarded up at a very remote date. The loft above the ceiling, which must have slanted door, was likewise inaccessible. When Gilman climbed up the ladder to the cobwebbed level loft above the rest of the attic, he found vestiges of a bygone aperture, tightly and heavily covered with ancient planking and secured by stout wooden pegs common in colonial carpentry. No amount of persuasion, however, could induce the stolid landlord to let him investigate either of these two closed spaces. As time wore along, his absorption in the irregular wall and ceiling of his room increased, for he began to read into the odd angles a mathematical significance which seemed to offer vague clues regarding their purpose. Old Keziah, he reflected, might have had excellent reason for having the room with peculiar angles, for it was not though certain angles that she claimed to have gone outside the bounds of world and space as we know. His interest gradually veered away from unplumbed voids beyond the slanting surfaces, since it now appeared that the purpose of these surfaces concerned the side he was already on. The touch of brain fever and the dreams began in early February. For some time, apparently, the curious angles of Gilman's room had been having a strange, almost hypnotic effect on him, and as the bleak winter advanced, he found himself staring more and more intently at the corner where the down-slanting ceiling met the inward slanting wall. About this period, his inability to concentrate on his formal studies worried him considerably, his apprehensions about the mid-year examinations being very acute. But the exaggerated sense of hearing was scarcely less annoying. Life had become an insistent and almost unendurable cacophony, and there was that constant terrifying impression of other sounds, perhaps from regions beyond life, trembling on the very brink of impression and audibility. So, far as concrete noises went, the rats in the ancient partitions were the worst. Sometimes their scratching seemed not only furtive, but almost deliberate, and when it came from beyond the slanting north wall, it was mixed with a sort of dry rattling, and when it came from the century-closed loft above, in the slanted ceiling, Gilman always braced himself as expecting some horror which only bided its time before descending to engulf him utterly. The dreams were wholly beyond the pale of sanity, and Gilman felt they must be a result of jointly his studies in mathematics and in folklore. He had been thinking too much about the vague regions which his formulae told him must lie beyond the 3 dimensions we know, and about the possibility that old Keziah Mason, guided by some influence past all conjecture, had actually found the gate to those regions. The yellowed county records containing her testimony and that of her accusers were so damnably suggestive of things beyond human experience, and the descriptions of her darting little furry object which served as her familiar were so painfully realistic despite their incredible detail. That object, no larger than a good-sized rat and quaintly called by the townsfolk Brown Jenkin, seemed to have been the fruit of a remarkable case of a sympathetic herd delusion, for in 1692 no less than 11 persons had testified to glimpsing it. There were recent rumors, too, with a baffling and disconcerting amount of agreement. Witnesses said it had long hair and the shape of a rat, but that its sharp-toothed, bearded face was evilly human, while its paws were like tiny human hands. It took messages betwixt old Keziah and the devil, and was nursed on the witch's blood, which it sucked like a vampire. Its voice was a kind of loathsome titter, and it could speak all languages. Of the bizarre monstrosities in Gilman's dreams, nothing filled him with greater panic and nausea than this blasphemous and diminutive hybrid, whose image flitted across his vision in a form of 1,000-fold more hateful than anything his waking mind had deduced from the ancient records and the modern whispers. Gilman's dreams consisted largely of plunges through limitless abysses of inexplicably colored twilight and bafflingly disordered sound, abysses whose material and gravitational properties and whose relation to its own entity he could not even begin to explain. He did not walk or climb or fly or swim or crawl or wriggle, yet always experienced a mode of motion partly voluntary and partially involuntary. Of his own condition he could not well judge, for sight of his arms, legs, and torso always seems cut off by some odd disarrangement of perspective, but he felt that his physical organization and faculties were somehow marvelously transmute or obliquely projected, though not without certain grotesque relationship to his normal proportions and properties. The abyss were by no means vacant, being crowded with indescribably angled masses of alien-hued substance, some of which appeared to be organic, while others seemed inorganic. A few of the organic objects tended to awake vague memories in the back of his mind, though he could not form any conscious idea of what mockingly resembled or suggested. In the later dreams, he began to distinguish a separate category into which the organic objects appeared to be divided, and which seemed to involve each case a radically different species of conduct pattern and basic motivation. Of these categories, one seemed to him to include objects less logical and irrelevant in their motions than the members of the other categories. All the objects, organic and inorganic alike, were totally beyond description, or even comprehension. Gilman sometimes compared the inorganic masses to prisms, labyrinths, clusters of cubes and planes, and cyclopean buildings. The organic things struck him variously as groups of bubbles, octopi, centipedes, living Hindu idols, and intricate arabesques, roused into a kind of Ophidian animation. Everything he saw was unspeakably menacing and horrible. Wherever or whenever one of these organic entities appeared by its motions to be noticing him, he felt a stark, hideous fright, which generally jolted him awake. Of how the organic entities moved, he could tell no more than how he moved himself. In time, he observed a further mastery, the tendency of certain entities to appear suddenly out of empty space, or to disappear totally with equal suddenness. The shrieking, roaring confusion of sound which permeated the abysses was past all analysis as to pitch, timbre, or rhythm, but seemed to be synchronous with vague visual changes in all the indefinite objects, organic and inorganic alike. Gilman had a constant sense of dread that might rise to some unbearable degree of intensity during one or other of its obscure, relentless, inevitable fluctuations. But it was not in these vortices of complete alienage that he saw Brown Jenkin. That shocking little horror was reserved for certain lighter, sharper dreams which assailed him just before he dropped into the fullest depths of sleep. He would be lying in the dark fighting to keep awake when a faint lambent glow would seem to shimmer around the centuried room, shewing in a violet mist convergence of angles and planes which seized his brain so insidiously. The horror would appear to pop out of the rat hole in the corner and patter towards him over the sagging, wide-planked floor with an evil expectancy in its tiny, bearded human face. But mercifully, this dream always melted away before the object got close enough to nuzzle him. It had a hellishly long, sharp canine teeth. Gilman tried to stop up the rat hole every day, but each night the real tenants of the petitions would gnaw away the obstruction, or whatever it might be. Once he had the landlord nail tin over it, but the next night the rats gnawed a fresh hole, in making which they pushed or dragged out of the room a curious little fragment of bone. That concludes our tale for this week, my friend. Please return next week, and we will continue The Dreams in the Witch House by H.P. Lovecraft. If you wish to rest some more, please find a space that suits you, whether you curl up by the fire, partake in some food and beverages in our kitchen, take a nap in one of our many rooms, or take a stroll around the garden. Please know you are always welcome at Sniper's Rest, my friend. If you're continuing your journey, the multiverse has a number of new journeys for you to explore. To the north, you're the most powerful thing in the world. You're the thing that monsters have nightmares about. And the UAC just woke you up. You don't need to go to hell, because hell came here, and you are programmed with one sole purpose: kill them all. To the west, an adorable ball of fluff could never cause so much damage, right? Right? Wrong. Your sole purpose is to make a mess, and no one will get mad at you because you're so cute. To the east, you work in fast food. It's not the most glamorous job in the world, but hey, a paycheck's a paycheck, right? Well, you've just been called in on your day off, and you're the only one working. Don't panic, here's your spatula. Good luck. And if you're making your own way out there, good luck, my friend, wherever you end up, wherever you come from, and wherever you're going. Thank you for spending some time here with us at Sniper's Rest. Remember to take care of yourself, be kind to others, hydrate, take a moment to look out into the world and marvel at how incredible it all is. How incredible you are, friend. Until next time, please take care on your way.